Well, good evening, everyone. Are you able to hear me okay? All right. Good evening. For those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, I'm Ashley Olson. I'm the Executive Director here at the National Willa Cather Center. And we are so pleased to welcome Kali Fajardo-Anstine for an invited lecture as part of our 69th annual Willa Cather Spring Conference. This event, of course, would not be possible without the generosity of many supporters. We are grateful to all the sponsors who provided financial assistance, especially our novelists, novella writers, and short story level sponsors. The Cather Project at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, John A. Yost and G. Wade Leake, Anna McCracken and the Ames Writers Collective, and Sydney Green and William Lord. Thank you again to all of our sponsors. I also want to offer our sincere thanks to Humanities Nebraska for their support of tonight's program. They've been a long supporter of the Willa Cather Spring Conference, and their support makes events like tonight's freely accessible to all. And Humanities Nebraska is a statewide nonprofit organization inspiring and enriching personal and public life by offering opportunities to thoughtfully engage with history and culture, with additional funding coming from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. Kali Fajardo-Anstine is the nationally best-selling author of the novel Woman of Light and the widely acclaimed short story collection Sabrina and Karina, a finalist for the National Book Award and winner of an American Book Award. She is a 2023 Guggenheim Fellow and the 2021 recipient of the Addison M. Metcalf Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Fajardo-Anstine is the 2022-2024 Endowed Chair in Creative Writing at Texas State University. Her introduction to Willa Cather's Death Comes for the Archbishop was published by Penguin Classics last year, so if you haven't picked it up, I would encourage you to do so. It's a beautiful essay. The title of Kali's talk is From Bookshelf to Dreamworld, Cather and the Underground Stream. Please give a warm Willa Cather Spring Conference welcome to Kali Fajardo-Anstine.
Good evening. It's very exciting to be here with you all. This is a huge honor for me. Thank you to the National Willa Cather Center for the invitation, and to all of you who have traveled far and wide to be with us here in Red Cloud. Tonight, I'd like to talk about the pleasure of reading and how Willa Cather's books have recently entered my life, giving me new language to understand both myself and the complexities within the role of the writer. In my life as an author, professor, former bookseller, English major, and all-around bibliophile, I have encountered many others like me, those who are always in the middle of a new book or old book, a hardback pile several inches deep on the nightstand, people who have formed vivid and critical life memories tied to literature. And in fact, I heard that there was just an engagement last night here at the conference. Congratulations. In many cases, you are all individuals who have devoted your entire lives to supporting and uplifting the world of books. I love book people. You are, in a sense, my people. In my past as a composition instructor, one of my favorite assignments was the literacy narrative, in which students recount their earliest and most formative experiences with books and reading. Recently, I gave a reading at La Vista Correctional Facility in Pueblo, Colorado, and spoke to a gymnasium filled with incarcerated women. "What have you been reading?" I asked a woman in sunglasses and a teal jumpsuit at my signing table. "So much," she had said. "We have a book club. We're all waiting in line for the next Sarah Maas book. And if you don't know what that is, it's romantasy. You have to read her." In fact, my husband and I did try to read her. If you like those books, I love reading. That's great. Anyway, but I smiled and I said, maybe soon. But this reminded me that as a bookseller, many of my regular customers were the formerly incarcerated. That's where I learned to love books, a man once told me. For 6 years, he said, it was the only way out of my cell. There are countless reasons why someone becomes a reader. Maybe it's to seek entertainment or the opportunity to learn, to travel, to dream. But for many of us book people, there is a deeper phase to the reading life. When plotting a screenplay, the final section of the first act is often referred to as the lock-in. There is the event that propels a character deeper into the world of adventure. Serious readers, the kind of readers you all are, often have a type of lock-in, a moment that pushes you further into the world of books. This is when you know that one day you will be a writer, a scholar, a librarian, a teacher, an editor, a bookseller, a historian, and on and on. In other words, you will do something for the rest of your life centered around books. For me, that lock-in came early enough, high school. Well, before I dropped out, but that's a story for another day. But it was this moment that I knew I would write books, and there was nothing else in the entire universe that I desired so much, and no one was going to stop me. The world is little. People are little. Human life is little. There is only one big thing: desire, the song of the lark. I have to admit to you all, I'm somewhat new to Willa Cather. Please don't judge me. We didn't read her in my high school that I dropped out of. It would happen gradually, then suddenly, as Hemingway might say, after being told for years by other book people and my Nebraskan father that I really ought to read her novels. But it wasn't until late one night in 2020, when I was writing a draft of my short story, The Yellow Ranch, that my eyes drifted from the computer to the bookshelf, where I spotted an old, faded copy of Death Comes for the Archbishop. In my 2023 Penguin Classics introduction to this masterpiece, I described this instant as if the book and I were making eye contact. It was a meeting, I wrote, destined to be. At the time, I was also finishing my first novel, Woman of Light, set in Denver, southern Colorado, and northern New Mexico. This book is based on the oral tradition of my maternal family line and details the lives of Indigenous and Chicano characters based on my ancestors. For this reason, it felt like divine intervention that I would come to Willa Cather's novel exactly when I did. In 2020, I was also adjusting to what I'll call my new life as a writer. In my old life as a writer, my identity as an artist was marked mainly by rejection. I began writing seriously in my early 20s, and I had some success with a handful of literary journals. Those lucky breaks only came after meeting notable writers and editors in person, and for a person who's never lived anywhere near New York City, this is easier said than done. In my pursuit of finding both a way to write books and a means to support myself, I lived across the country, taking jobs, fellowships, and graduate positions in places as far-flung as Key West, Florida, San Diego, South Carolina, Durango, Colorado, and Laramie, Wyoming. When looking at my submissions manager from this time, out of those 85 submissions in 8 years, I had 2 publication acceptances tracked on that website. Both were from the same journal, Southwestern American Literature. In my old life as a writer, I lived and breathed rejection. But in my new life, starting the year of my debut collection, Sabrina and Karina, I had been marked by something far greater than rejection: readers. It started slowly, no major reviews, no national TV or NPR, no celebrity book club. No, my new life as a writer began where my old life led off, in the land that I come from, in the American West. Readers in Denver began flocking to my book, telling others, pushing through word of mouth until eventually the rest of the country, or that small section of the country that reads literary short stories, caught on. Ultimately, those readers led to one of the greatest honors of my life so far. And in a rare and miraculous twist of fate, my rejection-filled path morphed overnight when Sabrina and Karina was named a finalist for the National Book Award. The day before the news went public, I walked across the prairie near my parents' home in Arvada, Colorado. As I stood atop a plateau gazing at the rippling grass, my friend Sebastian Doherty texted me. "It's like your last day as a muggle," he wrote. "You're going off to Hogwarts." That's me at Hogwarts. By the time 2020 rolled around, it was clear that I needed to widen my perception of myself as both an artist and a writer. I could no longer think of myself as someone who couldn't catch a break. I had caught one, a very big one, and oddly enough, this is also around the time when I first began reading Willa Cather. A man can do anything if he wishes to enough, St. Peter believed. Desire is creation, is the magical element in the process. If there were an instrument by which to measure desire, one could foretell achievement, the professor's house. I'm not surprised that I met Willa Cather's novels when I did. They arrived into my life under the most fortuitous circumstances. In her books, I found big-hearted Midwestern and Western characters with dreams and goals and passions, characters like sweet Jim Burden, after my own heart, a My Antonia whose deep intelligence and sensitivity is captivating, the brilliant and the strong Alexandra of O Pioneers, or the talented and precocious Taya Kronberg of The Song of the Lark. I devoured these novels, delighting in these eternal characters who contain the multitudes of a life, their stories giving guidance for ways to redefine and reshape the understanding of self. These characters and their hopes, secrets, and desires, they gave me new language to look back on my writerly journey, with reverence for my determination that allowed me to enter my new life as a writer. And though I did not realize it yet, Cather's novels were also widening my community of book people. When I first read My Antonia, I was at McDowell Colony in 2021 near Willa Cather's grave in New Hampshire. It was October. New England was lavish with trees that looked as if on fire. I had walked into town with my book and found a charming restaurant along the river. Someone had told me this river was special because it flowed north instead of south. There was only one couple in the small dining room besides me. They were possibly in their late 60s or early 70s. And after some time, the woman asked me what I was reading. My Antonia, I said, by Willa Cather. They shared an excited glance. "We love Willa Cather," they said. "Oh," I replied, "I'm just at this section with Pavel and the wolves. It's the most harrowing thing I've ever read." The couple and I chatted about wolves, about Nebraska, about Jim Burden, and much, much more until it was time for them to go. Later, when I asked the waitress for my check, she said, "Oh, no worries. That nice couple, they took care of it." I'll never forget that. How special I felt that day. How special the entire world felt that day. All that connection thanks to Willa Cather. In the coming years, there would be more moments of connection. There was a historian at the Library of Congress who made me feel culturally seen and acknowledged as part of our American identity. I had a feeling she must also love Willa Cather's books, and I was right. She gave me directions to her statue in the Capitol. Along the way, I met a congressional aide who gave me a private tour of the Capitol, stopping to point out the corn etched into the marble columns. "Do you want a picture with her?" he asked. And I thought, of course I do. I have traveled a long way for this picture. But this moment changed me. It made me feel like a person in my background is a foundational part of the American story. And that's something that's been very hard for me throughout my life. Willa Cather helped me in that too. Her personal life, her own realization of herself, was almost a subconscious existence, like an underground river that came to the surface only here and there at intervals months apart, and then sank again to flow on under her own fields. Nevertheless, The underground stream was there. Oh, pioneers. I have a memory of Nebraska in the thick summer heat with my father and my 6 siblings. Usually we visited my grandparents in Omaha around Thanksgiving, but on this trip we drove in July, stopping to eat sandwiches and to swim in an alcove of the Platte River. I had not been swimming in a river of that magnitude before. The water was brown, murky, and the cottonwood trees along the banks released white like miniature clouds. I don't know how it happened, but one moment I was splashing and playing in the cool lip of the swimming hole, and the next I was torn away from my family, engulfed by the larger stream. I can still see my father seconds before he jumped in after me, standing at the riverbank, tall, salt and peppered hair, even in his late 40s, red swimming trunks, an eagle tattoo on his arm. "Don't fight the current," he hollered. "You have to swim with the stream." In the years since I've started reading Cather, I have thought more about my relationship to Nebraska. One of the only short stories I wrote during graduate school that was not included in my thesis, or later Sabrina and Karina, is entitled "The Good Life," in honor of the state. Cather has brought about a broadening of my scope, her novels urging me to go back to that stream, allowing for more possibilities of setting, character, and expansion of the entire canvas. Cather has reminded me that, like her characters, I am a woman of multitudes, and so too is my writing. To fulfill the dreams of one's youth, that is the best that can happen to a man. No worldly success can take the place of that. Death comes for the Archbishop. Before I leave you tonight, I'd like to make one last stop, this time in the Dreamworld. In 2022, months before I published my debut novel, Woman of Light, my publishing team at Random House asked, "What is your biggest dream for this book?" I think they wanted me to say something like Oprah, or I want to be on the late night show. But instead, what I wanted most, what I deeply, deeply desired, was serious critical attention. I know that writers of color, writers of mixed backgrounds, writers of the American West, women writers, writers like me in more ways than one, we have historically been overlooked in the critical spaces, or very few of us have been let through the door. And so I told my team I would like a major review in the New York Times. The consensus was, "You're nominated for the National Book Award. Of course you'll be reviewed. Why wouldn't it be?" But it was here at Red Cloud, weeks before the publication, that I had a bad feeling. I remember walking the hallways of the Cather's second home, looking up at her portrait in the sitting room. I wrote my publisher from the kitchen table, pleading with them to keep pitching reviewers. I was told not to worry. The book would be reviewed. But it never was. Woman of Light was never reviewed in the New York Times or NPR or the Washington Post, and on and on. There she was again, my old life as a writer, coming back to meet me in my new life. I'm embarrassed to say that this sent me into an artistic depression. I felt ashamed, like I had let my readers down and my various communities. If I couldn't get the paper of record to print the words Indigenous Chicano, and what impact did I even have as a writer? The only thing that made me feel better during this time were my readings and my events, where over the course of a year I met droves of readers who were moved and changed by Woman of Light. But still, in the back of my mind, in that underground stream that controls so much of our thoughts and perceptions, I felt like a failure. Then one night, at 2:45, I woke from a dream. November 28th, 2022, 2:42 a.m. I was at an event for my book, and someone said Willa Cather was still alive and that she wanted to speak with me. She said that she enjoyed Woman of Light, and she compared it to Steinbeck. She was very old, and she asked if I wanted to walk with her for a moment. Do I believe this dream was a message directly from Willa Cather in the spirit world? Maybe. Probably not. Who can say? But what I can say is that this dream calmed me. It made me feel nurtured and mentored, and though it was only in the Dreamworld, a writer that I admired and cared enough about to not only read my work, but she decided to walk with me in this life. What this dream also showed me is how profoundly Cather's works and her life as a writer had entered my subconscious stream. Cather had become to me, as she has to so many others, an icon. What she symbolizes can change depending on the reader. To some, she's a feminist icon, a queer icon, a Western icon, a Midwestern icon, an American icon. To me, she is also all of the above, but she's also a mentor icon. My novel would be fine. It would go on to be a national bestseller, receive full-page reviews in the UK and Italy, win awards, including the Willa Award for historical fiction, and would bring even more book people into my life. My relationship to Cather's books has also propelled me deeper into her letters and lectures, where I have uncovered a rare and visionary type of business savvy. At the end of a long career, I doubt many will remember the bad reviews, the reviews not written, or even the raves printed in papers across the world. What is remembered are the stories and their characters and how they make us feel. Perhaps the single greatest gift that reading Willa Cather's novels has given me is an understanding that books are bigger than we are. At the end of a long life, who among us won't take pleasure in remembering the first time we opened the pages of My Antonia or O Pioneers, or the divine in making eye contact with Death Comes for the Archbishop? Who among us won't remember the beauty of walking with Cather's characters through the prairies and red deserts of our imaginations? Thank you, Willa Cather, for gifting us these stories, for connecting to us as readers in what should be an impossible feat, spanning the universe of our hearts and minds through time and space. And of course, thank you to all of you and readers everywhere who keep her stories alive. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kali, for that lovely talk. When you mentioned the decade you spent working as an independent bookseller, I couldn't help but think about Cather and the decade she spent in Pittsburgh working as a journalist, as a teacher. So, and I'm wondering when exactly you became interested in a career as a writer, if there was a moment that you had an epiphany that this is what you wanted to do, and how you carved out time for your creative work.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions, Ashley. You know, I always thought that I wanted to be a writer since I was like 8 years old, but my dad corrected me and said that he saw it become a serious obsession when I was in high school. And that's also around the time that I started working at Westside Books in Denver. It's a new, used, rare, and antiquarian bookstore. I got that job around, I think, 16. They needed help for the antiquarian book fair, and then I got hired on, and I think they liked me, so they kept me. And it became almost like a whole vocation. Like, I wanted to become a librarian. I wanted to do anything I could to possibly be around books. But at the same time, I was playing around and writing my own short stories. And I didn't think you could make a living as a writer, so I knew, coming from a background where we have to work, that I needed to find a job. And so it was not until I was in college, I think I was like a junior in college, and one of my professors said, "Hey, you're pretty talented, why don't you apply to MFA programs?" And up until that moment, I didn't even know they existed. So I ended up going to an MFA, dropped out of that one. I like dropping out, if you didn't pick up on that. And then I found a better fit at the University of Wyoming. And that's where I began really seriously writing short stories. And most of those would later appear in Sabrina and Karina.
Like Cather, of course, you've written historical fiction. Your novel, Woman of Light, is based in part on family history, in large part on family history. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about your research and creative process that went into that novel.
Yeah, so that novel was a new thing for me. Like, I had been writing these short stories in graduate school, and I was reading like Catherine Ann Porter and Edward P. Jones, and I was really studying the short form. But I knew when I was a high school student that like the books I loved were novels. Like, I didn't grow up reading short stories. I love short stories, don't get me wrong, they're great. But the books I fell in love with were these long form, like Kafka, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Like, I wanted to join the world of the novel. So I didn't have the skill level, though, when I first came up with the idea for Woman of Light. I was like a 22-year-old writer, and I really needed to hone that, that craft muscle. And along the way, that's when I fell in love with research. And I do think that came from my interest in library science. I had done a summer internship in Washington, D.C. in records management at the National Cancer Institute. And that's where I started realizing you can request records, you can look at things, there's tangible things you can look at. I did run into some issues because I come from a background of people where a lot of our records had not been kept or they had been erased. And a lot of my research was a combination of going to the archives, but also going into my elders' homes, so like a recording device, and saying, tell me your story, tell me what I need to know to get this right. One of my proudest moments, my godmother, who was also my great-grandmother's sister's daughter, so cousin, my godmother passed away last year from cancer. She was 85, and she convinced all of her cancer doctors and nurses that I was like the best writer on the planet, and they became fans. But one of my proudest moments is that she was able to make it to my book launch at Tattered Cover for Woman of Light, and she told me, it's not that I just know how to take the stories, but I also learned how to put them into a plot. And I was like, this woman was an electrician. She was not an English major, but she like knew this very craft specific thing. And it just made me feel so proud. But I loved the research process. And that's also why I first came out here to Red Cloud. I was researching for my introduction to Death Comes for the Archbishop. And I was like, of course I have to go to Red Cloud. I can't write this without seeing where Cather grew up.
I should mention to our audience tonight that you all, of course, are encouraged to pose questions to Kali. You should have received question cards, rather, when you came into the auditorium tonight. So if you have a burning question, go ahead and jot that down and raise your card in the air, and we'll have a staff member come around to collect those. I'm thinking a little bit about Sabrina and Karina, your collection of short stories, and Cather's book, collection of short stories, rather, Obscure Destinies, which a lot of us read in advance of this conference. That book was heralded as Cather's return to the West. Yeah. Your collection of short stories is also described as a Western novel. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how readers' and critics' perceptions of what constitutes the West has changed over time. I know a lot of people, when they think about a Western, they think about cowboys and Indians, the type of thing you might read in a dime store novel.
Yeah. You know, I think one of the funniest responses to Woman of Light was I saw somebody like post like an Instagram review of my novel, and they said, well, for a Western, I thought there'd be a lot more horses. And so I was like, so I think like one thing that I did not have enough of are the horses, but I did not set out to become a historical fiction writer or a Western writer, but I knew from being a bookseller that genres were important because it's one of the ways that you could get people to buy a book. If somebody's interested in thrillers, they go over to that section. If someone's interested in the Western, they go to that section. So I was really sort of attached to this idea that I was writing genre, even though I am a literary writer and I know that, but I like that idea of where it would be placed in the bookstore. I write about my ancestors and my own life in a lot of ways, and because I'm from the West, naturally, in some ways, it's going to be part of the Western. The Western is one of the only, I think it is the only genre that is both a genre and a place. And so I know that with Woman of Light, it was not what readers expected the Western to be. I think with the Western, they think about cowboys settling the West, and they think about this push from the East Coast to the West Coast until the nation was unified as across the coast, one huge nation. But I also was really interested in this idea that my ancestors on my mother's side, my great-grandmother, I remember when I was a little girl and she was dying of lung cancer, and she was like hooked up to machines, and she was in my grandfather's suburban house. And I remember her telling me stories about growing up in basically like a hut or a cabin that had a dirt floor and no running water and no electricity, and they lived in these mining towns. And I thought, this is incredible that she's gone through this huge transference of technology, that she's gone from this rural Western life to now living the end of her life in a city, surrounded by all of this. And so with Woman of Light, I really wanted to show that progression between what we think of as the traditional Western, and that's why there's two timelines if you haven't read it. There's a timeline in the 1860s, and there's a timeline in the 1930s. And I wanted to sort of unify the rural West and the urban West, but also what we think of as the modern West. But yeah, I did say that I first came to Willa Cather's novels in 2020, but that's not true, because when I was writing Sabrina and Karina, I actually had a book from Feminist Press that was called 2 by 2, and it had Old Miss Harris in it. And so that was like my first experience, was actually one of her short stories from that collection.
Going back to your collection of short stories, Sabrina and Karina, for me, something, of course, that tied those stories together was the existence of very resilient women. Cather, as we know, also had a knack for portraying very strong and independent and resilient women. What helps you form these characters and their stories? I'm imagining that perhaps you, like Cather, may have been surrounded by women whose stories influenced you in some way.
Yeah, I think, well, one of the facts about me is that I'm one of 7 siblings, and 6 of us are women. So growing up in that kind of family, there's no such thing as like, we were all very strong women. We all were like fighting to be heard over each other and stealing each other's clothes and hairbrushes and all of those things that come along with having so many sisters. But I come from a very matrilineal family. Like my father's family in Nebraska, I write about this a little bit in my introduction to Death Comes for the Archbishop. They were a very different culture than my mother's Chicano and Filipino side. They were more distant, they were quieter people, affection wasn't as displayed. So I remember my father like shaking my grandfather's hand goodbye instead of hugging him. So the family that I was around, mostly in Denver, was a very matriarchal family with women's stories leading the household. When I started writing, I didn't set out thinking that I was writing women's stories. And I remember looking at an Alice Munro book once, and the Library of Congress, one of the designations was women's fiction. And I thought, what? What is women's fiction? Isn't it all just fiction? And I think it was later when I was actually like getting ready to publish Sabrina and Karina, I thought, oh, I'm actually part of this tradition. I write women's fiction. And really what that means is I just write about my own experiences and the experiences of women around me, but men are also part of our experiences. They're not excluded from those books.
Well, let's transition and talk a little bit about Cather's Death Comes for the Archbishop. She attempts, of course, in that novel to portray the diversity, the convergence of cultures, and the really complicated history of New Mexico. I'm curious in your view of whether Cather, as a relative outsider, was she successful in those portrayals?
I mean, I think the bar of success, it does change depending on who's writing it. I think it's a successful novel, but I did recently have a meal with a friend of mine. He's a historian in New Mexico, and he said, that was so controversial that you decided to write about Death Comes for the Archbishop. And I said, why is that controversial? I didn't know. And he said there was actually, for a long time, a lot of scholars in Chicano studies, there was a lot of backlash against the book. And it did not get up to me in Arvada, Colorado as a teenage bookseller. I never got the gossip. So I didn't know. And he said, well, I think your introduction, it doesn't have to address that because that's not what you were thinking about with the novel. But my experience reading the novel was profound because I have been searching for myself in literature my entire life. Yes, I can read about a boy wizard flying a broom all around and I can identify with that wizard, but that's not me. I'm not that character exactly. So my whole life I've been searching for myself in books, and while I've yet to be able to find exactly myself in books, but maybe in the books I have written, what happened when I read Death Comes for the Archbishop is I saw characters who might be related to me. It might not exactly be our stories told from our perspective, but it was sort of like a great American writer was glimpsing my people. And I'm not sure if the detail is 100% accurate. I do talk about, there is one woman character, Magdalena, that I think she's both like this incredibly powerful woman character, but she's also diminished in some ways that could be perceived as racist. But I still think that this is a very special book to me because up until this moment, I had never read a book in American literature where I felt like, there we are. Even though I didn't feel like it was being told from our perspective, I felt like we were being glimpsed. And that was enough to change me, to make me feel like we do exist in literature.
In your introduction to Death Comes, you wrote, as a Chicana of mixed European and indigenous ancestry, defining my cultural heritage and the historical framework that created a person like me often proves difficult, which you just mentioned. Death Comes made an impact of my own history tangible through story. So this really comes back to identity, which you touched on, which is so much more complicated than checking one box or another. I wonder if you might say a bit more about that.
Yeah, you know, I am a mixed person. I am a person that is formed out of the convergence of the nation. My father's family, they're Polish and German from Omaha, but they've kind of lost that. They're just what we would call white people. But my grandma does make runzas. But my mother's side is very multicultural. My maternal grandmother is Jewish. My great-grandfather came from the Philippines, and my great-grandmother, she was a mixed indigenous Chicana from southern Colorado. And so there have been times where I've been on panels and I have described all of that, and I've actually been met with laughter. Like, how could a person be all those things? How could that exist? And I think that's because part of the American project was to deny and erase all those different backgrounds. And one of the reasons I think that Willa Cather's works are so important is because it's actually allowing people who maybe now consider themselves white to look back and say, actually, I do come from a heritage. I do come from a culture. But for me, when I'm reading her books and I'm thinking about my identity, it makes me feel like my background as a woman of color is actually still part of all these other stories, these stories of European settlers in Omaha or in Nebraska. And that was really one of my big takeaways when I was working on this introduction for Death Comes for the Archbishop. And I was coming out here to Red Cloud, I was doing all the research. I actually drove to see my parents and my family in Omaha because my little sister was graduating from Creighton Law School. And the first thing I think I said to my father when I walked through the door of the hotel, I was like, how did our people get to Nebraska? Like, it had never occurred to me that that was also part of my story. And I think that what she's really given me is this gift of understanding that my convergence is part of the American story.
Well, one more question for you before we open it up to the audience. I just wanted to ask, what's next? Is there another novel or collection of short stories in the works for you?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of a novel right now. It's a little bit different because it's set in the future. It's set in 2045. But I've expanded my idea of sort of the setting. It's no longer just Denver and Colorado. I'm actually writing up into Wyoming where I live. And the reason I'm setting it in the future, not only because the character like came to me in a rush one time like 10 years ago and I could see her entire world, but I'm really interested, like I mentioned my great-grandmother and the transition from a life without electricity and a life without running water. I'm really interested in how my generation, but also the next generation and Generation Alpha, can you believe it, they are going to be coming up. I'm really interested in how technology and land are tied together, and I'm curious about what's going to happen in the next couple generations, especially with our identity as Westerners. So, yep, there's a novel coming, and I just have to finish it, and then you guys can read it.
Well, we will await the publication with great anticipation, of course. Rachel, does anyone in our audience have questions for Kali? All right. First question. What is your opinion about the state of Latina, Latino, Hispanic authors in the United States?
My opinion is that it is bumping right now. This is just an incredible time for Latinx, Latina literature. And I think this is also a time where so many of us that are coming from nuance are allowed to have our voices heard. One of my best friends is the writer Ivelisse Rodriguez. She's a Puerto Rican writer. I love her short story collection, Love War Stories. I loved John Manuel Arias's Where There Was Fire, that he's a Costa Rican American writer. And growing up in Denver, Ivelisse and I are really good friends, and I joke because we actually met at Ghost Ranch. That's so crazy. Now I think about it, I'm like, all this Willa Cather stuff. We met at Ghost Ranch in New Mexico probably 15 years ago, but I remember telling her we were outside sitting under a tree in the shade, and I said, I don't think I've ever had a Puerto Rican friend. And she's like, I don't think I've ever had a Chicana friend. And that had formed the basis of this friendship, but we were learning about each other's cultures. And yeah, I think that right now, there's such an explosion of literature. One of the things, though, I think that also young writers need to be careful of is not falling into tropes. And that has historically been something that happens when the publishing industry sees something working. They might push writers into writing in this certain style, or why aren't you all writing magic realism? So I think that I would tell young Latino writers, find your own style, and don't feel pressured into fitting into the mold that's already been successful, because that's how we get new and innovative voices.
You opened your talk this evening by referencing incarcerated women, and you seem very touched by that experience. What lessons have you learned from that engagement, and how, if at all, does it touch your writing?
Yeah, one of my short stories in Sabrina and Karina is about an incarcerated woman named Nicole, and she's been recently released. And one of the ways that she finds meaning in her life is taking her nephew to the library so they could read books together. I come from a family that's very justice-minded. My little sister, who graduated from Creighton, her name is Piper. She's a public defender in a small rural town in Colorado right now, and she's never more proud than when she gets somebody free. And I think that for me as a reader, I'm very touched by the fact that books have the ability to transport people and give their minds something to do, especially if you're incarcerated. But yeah, that was not my first experience, but it was the most recent one I had. And it was, in some ways, it was sort of difficult because I looked out at the room and I realized a lot of these women could be related to me. They could be my cousins. And usually when I give a reading, if it's not in Denver, it's not really majority of my background, but this prison reading was majority of my background. And so that did make me reflect on just the different avenues our lives can go down and how easily that can happen to somebody.
Do you feel that your work is reaching young readers, and do you think about a particular reader or audience when you write?
I'm really lucky because I know that young readers are being forced to read my stuff in school. But I do think that especially Sabrina and Karina is reaching a lot of young readers. I've gotten a lot of messages over the years. I've gotten handwritten letters from teenagers, and I didn't even know teenagers sent letters. I got a letter like last year, and I looked up this girl's town, and it was like one silo, and I was like, this is amazing. She's reading A Woman of Light out there. Yeah, it's been a big honor for me because young readers are the adult readers of tomorrow, and they're also going to be all of our ancestors someday. Like, they are in charge of what is going to be popular for decades to come. In terms of like, I don't know. I mean, I think my books are also touching people of all ages, though. I recently got a letter, last week I got an email from a woman, and she was in her late 80s, and she said that she had never been able to find her family history in a novel, and she found it in Woman of Light. And I told my literary agent, I'm gonna write her when I get back from Nebraska. But I was working on my talk, and I was like, no, I need to write my readers back right away. And so I wrote her a letter back, and I said, my history is your history too. This book also belongs to you. But yeah, it's been a big honor to reach readers of all ages. But I like young readers coming to book signings. They're so cool. Like, they bring you gifts. They get their nails painted like your cover. Like, it's been really special.
They set the bar very high, it seems.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kali. It's been really a joy to spend this time together. Thank you for sharing your story and your stories with us. And thank you for helping us elevate Cather's work to a wider audience. It's been a pleasure. A round of applause for Kali. Kali.